Thank you so much. And just want to say thank you to our community and Teams Nation for putting on this event. I've worked with Peter and Chris and the wider group. Sorry for anyone I'm leaving out quite a bit. They are very important to us at Teams and Microsoft. So again, I just want to say thanks. And I think these sessions are a lot of fun because we can maybe push some limits like we'll do in this one. So to Peter's point, without further ado, my name is John Gruszczyk. I'm a product manager here at Microsoft, working on anything security, compliance, privacy, governance related to Teams. And today's session we're going to talk about is demystifying encryption and protecting your team's environment. And so it's a mouthful, but what it really means is we're going to talk about how encryption applies to organizations, some of the pros and cons of it, as you think about kind of hardening your data protection and governance strategy. And we're going to kind of talk about maybe some future encryption capabilities in Teams, how to think about those, and then of course, how to bring it all together. So I like, if you haven't been in a session with me before, I love engagement, open interaction, Q&A. So I have about 25 to 30 minutes of content, which should leave plenty of time of open interaction, engaging discussion. I am all for discussion. That is you saying, hey, this is how we do things, is, you know, open and interactive is the goal. So, and let's go ahead and get started in the kind of core content, a quick agenda for the day. We're going to talk about understanding encryption and kind of the common scenarios that we see for organizations. We'll talk about encryption in Microsoft Teams and the wider Microsoft 365 and even Microsoft ecosystem. And then we'll wrap up with some additional Microsoft encryption capabilities that we've seen customers use for certain compliance and regulatory obligations. If you are sitting there thinking, I have no idea what encryption is, or you are a cryptography expert, this session is geared to be about a 200 level explanation and kind of give the, kind of high level architecture. So we won't be going into cryptography discussion or key arrangement or anything like that, but it's helpful to understand kind of, again, how we view encryption across organizational level. So a very short story I'd like to just kind of get across here is in the United States here, it's very common growing up in kind of suburban neighborhoods to when you have your garages, we had these little kind of panels that electrical panels that you could enter your garage code in and it would open up your garage. And so, as kids growing up, we would go over to each other's houses and you would have each other's garage codes. And what that essentially meant, though, is you had plenty of very young, immature kids running around the neighborhood with each other's garage codes and would oftentimes leave garages open or quite insecure. And so, what happens when someone uses that garage code maliciously, or they tag along, or again, they leave the garage open, and someone is able to essentially walk into your real estate and take everything that's in your garage. And so this is a short, funny little way to essentially say, garage code is what enables your access to your entire kingdom. So you don't want to give out your garage code. And while encryption and the actual cryptography keys and process behind it is very, very hard for hackers to breach, an important thing is if your encryption key or anything you're using in this is given away or breached, it's not going to work the way that you think. So again, keep things ultra secure, keep information at a need to know basis. And so again, garage code is a much more open way, but again, encryption is only as good as you are protecting that type of encryption and decryption key. So let's start it off with a very kind of 1 to 200 level explanation. Encryption is not scary. I'm sure quite a few of you are using it in your personal lives, as I do as well. And so let's start with a very, very baseline definition. End-to-end encryption, or what you commonly see abbreviated as E2EE, is the encryption of information at its origin and decryption at its intended destination without the ability for intermediate nodes or parties to decrypt. So in even simpler terms, able to send a message or content to another receiving party, only you two can actually see the content of that information. The entire time it is being sent, it is essentially undecipherable. And so I want to be very clear, these next couple slides are for illustrative purposes only. They do not represent service descriptions or service levels or anything in Microsoft. They are purely for examples. And so example on the screen is a basic text messaging email service without any sort of encryption in it. Whether I'm at my computer or I'm on my phone sending a SMS or text message, As soon as I hit send, it's going to go across the internet or however you want to vision this journey through its channel to the receiver. And in that entire process, anyone can actually intercept that message, read it, and understand if there were contents attached with it, where it came from, all the actual kind of metadata behind that message. So the idea behind end-to-end encryption is that you see there's this green bar that goes across. So essentially, once I type and finish that email, or well, in this case, stick to kind of SMS messaging. Once I finish that and hit send, that message is fully encrypted with a key that only myself and that receiver has access to decrypt. And so at any point as it hops along its journey, an intercepting party or even a data provider, internet provider is not able to access the contents of that information. And so if we stop there, a lot of people, I assume, would say, wow, that is a fantastic security privacy feature. Why are more organizations not doing that? And we will get to that. And so I want to be very clear as I take off my Microsoft hat and say, as a tech geek, someone very much involved in the industry, end-to-end encryption is fantastic for consumers. I won't try and hide that. I personally use an end-to-end encrypted messaging service myself. The problem is when we start to think about that in terms of the enterprise or organization, there are some feature limitations that come with end-to-end encryption, and then there are also some legal and other challenges that encryption introduces. And so we'll get to that. But let's go over a couple other common encryption scenarios because these will help paint the essentially problems that end-to-end encryption can create. So when we think about an end-to-end encrypted message that goes across data centers, again, I think this from the prior slide represents the more reality that as you send a message, it is going through your internet service provider, or if, let's just say Microsoft had a text messaging service that doesn't exist, we send it, it would go obviously through its data processing and controlling. So again, you see here, as you send that message, it will go out fully to your receiving party, and the receiving party are the only ones who would be able to actually see that message. As we go on, this is where most organizational or major software providers, the level of encryption they provide, what is commonly called encryption in transit and at rest. And this is actually a really good representation. Again, we are not representing how Microsoft actually works, Cisco, any other company, other than this is a good visual representation. So what happens is when I send that message, again, this is not end-to-end encrypted, but when I send that message, it is encrypted using, in this case, Microsoft encryption technologies, using common transport layers, TLS, etc. But the reason why we don't call it end-to-end encrypted is because when that message hits the data center, right, we also store it encrypted, but the customer needs to be able to access their own customer data, which means we can't have it truly end-to-end encrypted as it sits in the data center. So every part of this process, your content is encrypted. You can go on Docs and look at the Microsoft 365 encryption journey, or just Microsoft encryption in general, and you will see that it's backed by encryption in transit at rest. And again, most other major software vendors follow the same idea. And the reason why you have this different key color in here and there's not that uniform green is, again, customers need to be able to access their data at any point, and when it's being stored at rest and is encrypted, they need to be able to decrypt and access it. And so again, it's why you will see a slightly different journey along in this, and this will help kind of paint some pictures on why end-to-end encryption is actually challenging for organizations to embrace fully. So you'll see the major difference as I go back one slide is we have encryption in transit at rest. I'll move forward. We see the application of end-to-end encryption for organizations. And again, illustrative purposes only. I'm sure there are some of you that are thinking, wow, this is the most gross misrepresentation of end-to-end encryption. There should be hops and points. I get that. We could certainly drain this slide and add a bunch more graphics, but simplicity is key. So again, the idea would be in an end-to-end in an organization that is choosing to use end-to-end encryption for some type of communication, you're going to see that green bar pipe in here. And essentially, again, we go back to that. As soon as I send a message to my colleague, whether it's through email or Teams, in this scenario of end-to-end encryption, Microsoft actually would not have any insight into what that message was. And so as I communicate with my teammate, we're able to talk about, let's say, functional specs or something top secret that kind of makes sense that maybe we don't want to have any sort of transcription or assets or materials related to. But the one of the challenges can be, again, is that is fully end-to-end encrypted. The organization cannot actually access any of that information. So if we are working on something that is related to, in the US, the Department of Justice, where we are instructed to keep files and conversation history related to this project, end-to-end encryption might actually invalidate that. And so that will be the second part that we talk about. But no, there are key trade-offs when you choose to bring end-to-end encryption into an organization. And so this is kind of the first part about just explaining it. And so I hope that this wasn't too quick for anyone, but the common idea is, yes, end-to-end encryption offers a heightened sense of privacy, not necessarily security. And the reason why that's key to differentiate is because that's how we see end-to-end encryption being used in organizations, is for a heightened sense of privacy. And so that might be, again, we think back to the scenario of me calling up a fellow engineer and needing to talk about a functional spec or design spec for a product that we really don't want to have any artifacts be related to. So again, transcription, translation, whatever it may be, we want that call to be in secret, almost as if we were meeting in a Microsoft conference room that was completely isolated to just us two in a private room. And not just at Microsoft, I've been on other large customer campuses where they have these kind of innovation or R&D rooms where essentially you can be ensured you are free of recording or other property so you can talk about these items. And so again, that's where this kind of heightened privacy comes in with end-to-end encryption. Another common scenario we heard that initially started this was you think about like financial earnings or discussion calls. And so initially a lot of folks were like, yeah, absolutely, we want end-to-end encryption for that. Trade-off comes, which we will now use as a segue into our next part of the session, is that you can't actually apply certain features when something is end-to-end encrypted by design, like recording, translation, transcription, because, again, by design, an end-to-end encrypted communication should not have artifacts of what the contents of that message was, what were discussed. There is no tangible evidence that essentially occurred other than you can see an encrypted communication went across. And so now we realize the challenges that end-to-end encryption can cause for organizations. And so what we're going to do is go ahead and start with a high-level overview of encryption at Microsoft. And I want to be very clear, this first line is not me reciting it because it's something that I think folks will find cheesy or I have to say it. This is a serious promise that we make. The customer data is the customer data. You own it, you control it, you can access it at any time. And so again, that means in your process, if you are sending emails, whatever, and they are being stored at rest, you need to be able to access that whenever you'd like. And so Microsoft 365 encryption for data in transit and at rest is the most common applicable scenario for general service level engagement. Right, your content is still encrypted. It's encrypted essentially what we call point to point. And so as your content hops, it is still protected. It is still secure. It's the fact that as your content travels, we enable you to decrypt and access it at any time. So for the large majority of customers, standard encryption in transit and at rest, whether it's with Microsoft or another service provider, is likely going to meet your security, privacy, and compliance needs. Again, it is still encrypted traffic. That does not mean it is insecure or unsafe. Now, what we also do is provide varying encryption options that help support additional customer requirements around things like industry, regional, or just internal compliance requirements. So that might be things like, hey, I need to hold my own key arrangements based on my global regulations. Or maybe there are some items around customer lockbox, which we'll talk about. So we want to fully acknowledge that encryption in transit and at rest is not necessarily the end-all be-all solution for customers who may be looking for additional options, either for heightened privacy, like end-to-end encryption, or perhaps, again, they face legal compliance obligations that requires them to essentially either control their encryption a little bit better or have additional options. And so what I'd like to move along to do is kind of talk about baseline encryption as it applies to Microsoft. We're going to hop into end-to-end encryption in Teams, where we're going with it, and then a few additional capabilities that we see kind of rounding out the encryption journey, and then we'll get to an open scenario. So again, we are keeping with, open questions. Keeping to baseline encryption in transit and at rest. This is, again, a decently illustrative purposes-only slide that explains how traffic moves. So we have a customer on their Windows PC. They've logged in through domain services. As they communicate with Microsoft 365 servers and workloads, you will see that as traffic, as content travels in transit, we have SSL, TLS encryption to protect client server, server to server, data center to data center, or DC to DC communications. When your data is sitting at rest, we have BitLocker protecting for theft and appropriate handling on disk or server. And then we have service encryption, which provides a separation of duty between OS admin and data. In simpler terms, again, wherever your traffic travels, whether it's in transit or it's sitting there at rest, it is encrypted and it is protected. So again, we are trying to debunk this idea that end-to-end encryption is going to add a heightened level of, a majorly heightened level of security, because it is much more seen and used as a privacy feature. Again, I do not want to dismiss the importance of end-to-end encryption, what it can provide, and the solutions that it's solving for. But in general, organizations are going to rely and use encryption in transit at rest for the majority of their channels and communication. So now we'll get to, I think, what a lot of people have been excited about, and that is end-to-end encryption in Teams. And so I know some folks might be sitting there thinking, John, you just talked about why we don't want this and why it's not bad and why Microsoft should never bring it to market. But again, we've been listening to our customers, and we do understand that end-to-end encryption does have use cases within organizations. I will share some feedback we've gotten talking from global organizations that are interested in using end-to-end encryption for communication. They were very clear with Microsoft on, say, three things. First, IT must have full and complete control of it. No one should be able to opt in to end-to-end encryption without IT enabling for them. The second part is that end users must be able to communicate both end-to-end encrypted and using their standard forms of communication. The basis behind that was customers are clear with us in those, engineer to engineer use cases. End-to-end encryption is use case for us when heightened privacy is needed. Otherwise, we do take advantage of compliance, transcription, etc. So users need to be able to use both mechanisms. And then the third area is that, yes, it is extremely use case specific. And so we have talked to a couple customers that were interested in end-to-end encryption as a wider solution. But the overwhelming majority have been clear with us that we are looking to use end-to-end encryption for either specific user groups, department levels, or even meeting type use cases. So that being said, what is currently available in Teams today is end-to-end encryption for one-to-one calling. And I will be very specific. That means if I pick up the phone and call someone directly, we are both enabled by IT and we have both opted into end-to-end encryption. We can complete that call using end-to-end encryption. If at any point I add a third party in there, or we do something through Meet Now or a scheduled meeting, end-to-end encryption is not available. So again, it is very specific to a use case of one-to-one calling. And in that one-to-one call, only the audio and video is end-to-end encrypted. So your chat that goes on in there is using our standard encryption in transit and at rest. So again, it does not mean your chat is insecure. It just means that it's not end-to-end encrypted. As part of this, though, when I make that one-to-one end-to-end encrypted call, recording, transcription, merge, call park, a handful of features are disabled. So again, if we're doing this meeting to talk about a functional spec where we don't need artifacts, I'm not worried about it. But if we're having a one-to-one call where we're doing some whiteboarding, some project design, maybe that content needs to be protected, but we want those artifacts. So we can do things like storing them in a secure SharePoint container or adding a sensitivity label to it to protect and encrypt that content itself. So again, that's where we have this clean break. What is the kind of use case of this call? Is it to keep no artifacts and have essentially no record of the call being made? Or is it sensitive discussions that we want to apply heightened protections to those artifacts? If that is the case, we would complete a normal call. And then again, those meeting artifacts we can store in secure sites. Maybe you have an on-prem location that has robust security to it, etc. But there is a clear break between the artifacts being secure and the artifacts not existing in themselves. So typical use cases, if heightened sensitivity or privacy is needed without any sort of recording or transcription or meeting artifacts being produced. And a general how to use it. First and foremost, IT controls it. They must enable end users. And so they must go into your team's admin center and they must either through groups or end user by end user basis, go in there and enable that user to be able to complete end-to-end encrypted calling. Then the end user, after been enabled by IT, can go into their team's settings and they will find a checkbox that says to opt in for end-to-end encryption. Lastly, assuming that myself and I'll pick on Peter, myself and Peter have been both enabled by IT and we've opted in our Teams client itself. If I go to my dial pad and I call Peter directly in a one-to-one VoIP call, we would then complete an end-to-end encrypted call. To validate it, you will see in your upper left-hand corner, end-to-end encryption enabled is for this call. You will have your cryptography key that you can validate with your callee party to, again, validate that you are an end-to-end encrypted. If you are in a non-encrypted call, you will see our standard shield up here that will just make a note. It is backed by M365 encryption. So we do make sure that we give a visual display. So next two slides are just some slideware. You will see in the left, this is a standard call or meeting. On the right-hand side, you will see a one-to-one encrypted call. So again, we do make a box appear for you. This is very common practice in the industry to validate that you have completed a call. End-to-end encryption for one-to-one calling is available on mobile for iOS and Android as well. So from the end user experience on that side, again, you will still see your encryption verification. So if you do need to kind of start each meeting off, sorry, not meeting, one-to-one call off with validating your end-to-end encrypted key. That is something that is not uncommon. So again, we need to make sure that verifies and you have symbols to validate that you are in an end-to-end encrypted call. So some frequently asked questions around end-to-end encryption. I won't drain all of these because this is quite a wordy slide and I believe slide decks will be made available. So I'll kind of quickly go over them. We talked about, yes, certain features do get disabled. These are things that are limitations of end-to-end encryption and not Microsoft's design or architecture in itself. Across Zoom, Cisco, Microsoft, when end-to-end encryption is enabled, you will see all of us as providers will say these features get disabled. So again, maybe in the future, there will be some technological advancements where an end-to-end encrypted call could somehow be recorded or transcribed. At this current time, there is technology limitations on how that can be done. And again, the kind of original creation of end-to-end encryption was meant to be essentially no artifacts, no tangible evidence as this call occurred. So we're seeing some interesting kind of ideas thrown out there about, yes, we want to be able to record something that initially shouldn't ever have artifacts. So we like to say that, the future is uncertain. So you never know what type of technologies may be disabled. But as of now, we do not see these limitations being lifted. Key is, yes, end users can enable and disable E2EE as needed. So again, if you are in a situation where you might be calling Peter again, who we both know, or we both know that each other, if we completed it as normal, it'd be end-to-end encrypted, but we want to record that call, we can go into our settings and turn it off and complete that call. Talked about the availability. Again, end-to-end encryption is not available for anything outside of one-to-one direct calls. So if you are group calling, if you're bringing someone into a call, meet now, scheduled meetings, these are all out of our current support right now. We have talked about our journey and kind of where we see end-to-end encryption going. We're still working with customers regularly, understanding their use cases for end-to-end encryption in things like, multi-calls, meetings. And so we have made a commitment. That's what we're looking to bring to market next. I don't have anything to share on timelines or, cryptography diagrams or architecture. We have made our public statement on where we are going, and we will continue working towards that. Last area I just want to briefly address is Making an end-to-end call does not necessarily mean it is less secure. So again, I know there are folks that can sit here and argue with me and rightfully probably win that end-to-end encryption does add a layer of security from as far as being able to breach the contents of that communication in transit. But end-to-end encryption is really focused around privacy, right? The elimination of artifacts or tangible evidence that this occurred. And so we don't want this perception to get out there that, you know, a non-end-to-end encrypted call or meeting is insecure. Because we have protections across all providers that you can heighten, like, you know, limiting participants or kind of locking down that meeting. So again, we want to really get this out there that, you know, end-to-end encryption is a great feature for privacy or increased sensitivity. It does have an element of security to it, but a non-end-to-end encrypted communication is not necessarily insecure, especially when, again, most major providers are using encryption in transit and at rest, which is essentially point-to-point versus end-to-end. All right, a couple last items before we will break out into an open discussion. I talked about there are some additional workloads or capabilities that Microsoft supports for customers that may need to have additional controls over encryption or may be looking to do things like, you know, provide their own key. And so if you haven't heard of customer key, essentially that's what it allows your customers to do. We have a handful of customers that through regulatory obligations, industry, regional requirements, whatever it may be, they actually need to control the root keys. And so what this means is that through customer key, you will work directly with Microsoft, and it's commonly heard of bring your own key, BYOK, hold your own key, HYOK, where you work directly with Microsoft and provide those root keys. And so I want to be clear, if you are a customer that you're looking at this and like, yeah, I'd like to bring my own key. If you are not facing compliance or regulatory obligations to do so, customer key might not be for you. I do not want to mislead anyone on what this is designed to do. If this sounds interesting, please check out our docs page on customer key to fully understand the capabilities, what it's solving for. And if there are any customers that are currently using customer key, post in the chat, share how you're using it, the value, or whatever it may be. But I want to be very clear, this is not meant as like an add-on for customers to provide their own key because they want to. It is really targeted towards customers that face these obligations per legal requirements. 3 additional capabilities that are related to essentially encryption of information. Customer lockbox, which we will formally be announcing, so you get a free treat here. General availability to support Microsoft Teams. And so if you're not familiar with what customer lockbox is, this could probably be its own session in itself. But there are organizations that face, again, increased compliance, legal, different requirements when Microsoft engineers need to work on your service operations. And so there is a whole slew of legal contractual obligations when Microsoft engineering is working on your, essentially working in your tenant or working with you on a service operation behalf. Customer lockbox adds more strict and stringent controls on when that kind of process or how that process works. So again, there are very specific legal contractual requirements that all customers are backed by. Customer lockbox is designed for customers that through specific legal or regulatory requirements must have heightened levels of access is the wrong word, heightened layers of operations essentially. So again, if you've never heard of customer lockbox and you don't hear about these different types of requirements, it probably isn't for you, and that's perfectly okay. If you are interested in it or you think, hey, I've heard something like this, please go to our docs page and then you can reach out to me directly. I do not want to mislead anyone on what these features are designed to do. Second one is email encryption with Office 365 message encryption, or if you've been in the game for a while, OME is, I believe, the common abbreviation. And so again, this is essentially being able to encrypt your email messages as they go. This snaps into our Microsoft information protection story, in my opinion, again, being able to communicate in that kind of end-to-end style. So emails, messaging is important. It's still not going away as much as we represent Teams here. It is still a huge volume of communications daily. So again, you may be sending out something like a wide email to leadership or even just a briefing internally. You might want to be able to put a encryption to that message or even tag a sensitivity label, which takes us to the third item. This is one of my favorite things that Microsoft has ever done, selfishly, is sensitivity labels, because in short, we can encrypt the content at the content itself. And what that means is that now is essentially using identity as the access control. And the reason why that's so important is because at Microsoft, I could be sitting with the latest Teams engineering redesign functional spec. I could forward that document to my own Outlook email, and I could be on the same computer. I will not be able to open that essentially document through my Outlook email because I don't have that John Gruszek identity behind it. Then we can double down with things like sensitivity labels and integrate with multi-factor auth or conditional access policies so that when I am trying to access a sensitive piece of content, not only is that content encrypted to ensure that the right identity is accessing it, but then I can start to challenge things on that accessor. So I can say, hey, are you coming from a safe device that we validated through Intune or a different management solution is what we deem safe? Can we validate that you're coming from a trusted IP address, or at least a real IP address that is in an area that we expect? Other properties like that. And we can even do things like with continuous access evaluation now in Microsoft, we can now challenge essentially that identity and the safeness of that accessor in more real time. So I believe the token is now down to about 5 minutes, which is, in my opinion, much safer than a 60-minute extension token, right? For 60 minutes, I could then be going through SharePoint or whatever based on that access. Even if at minute 6, something changed, right? My IP changed, or I was using a Tor browser and tricked some folks into who I really was. Handing that access token and essentially giving that handshake every 5 minutes is able to secure, or is able to provide an extra layer of security that those folks are who we think they are. And so a double click into sensitivity labels, because again, I think this is a great feature at Microsoft for just content protection, but we have received overwhelming feedback from customers that, hey, this works across Microsoft 365 and Office and Outlook, like where's the integration in Teams? And so this isn't new. This came out about a year ago, is the integration of labels in Teams. So if you're a customer that have set up labeling in your organization and enabled it, you can run, I believe, a few pretty simple PowerShell scripts, and you can get it enabled into your Teams environment. What this allows you to do as an end user is creating a Microsoft team or an IT admin or champion. They can actually apply a sensitivity label to that team itself. And so we can do some very basic restrictions like, hey, we're going to make this team private only. We're going to make this team internal only and block outside guests. And then you can also hook in with things like, again, kind of some of those device management properties where as they access SharePoint sites, we can do checks on the device to make sure that it's safe and healthy, or that person is who they say they are. So sensitivity labels, we've heard feedback on, hey, we'd love to apply these into chats and channels at the granular level. So nothing to share other than please keep that feedback coming on how you're using labels within your organization, where you'd like to see them extend to, because in my journey as coming from the field into corporate, sensitivity labels have been one of the things that when customers are mature on it, they love it. They want to see wider integration. And so we would love to understand, like, how can we make this easier? So either in the chat, if you have my email, LinkedIn, however it is, would love to hear how you're using labels across the org, across your Microsoft ecosystem, and where you think that Microsoft could potentially do better at making, wider integrations or kind of those exchanges. I am not going to drain this slide. This is kind of how we look at team security, safety all up. In essence, Teams, as much as this might pain me to say, Teams is not necessarily unique. We inherit Microsoft 365 security and compliance by design, because the reason why I say by design is the same way that you are managing Exchange and SharePoint, OneDrive, or even the apps like Outlook and etc. for mobile devices. Teams probably isn't that much different, right? Teams is built on top of SharePoint, so you have files in there. It's real-time communication, but email flowing back and forth. So one of my favorite demos I do is I have an entire kind of mobile application management policy set up for Outlook, OneDrive, Yammer, and SharePoint apps on a mobile device, and it's so easy to hit that checkbox for Teams. Could also have more granular level policies based on teams as needed. But again, the beauty of Teams is that we inherit those great Microsoft 365 capabilities. We are not trying to innovate anything special. If we do, like information barriers, we actually work to then validate it across a wider group. So that was information barriers as an example of a team-specific feature that then got extended out to SharePoint and OneDrive as well. Next steps. I know I'm 5 minutes past my time for questions, so I'll quickly kind of cover this. If your head's spinning because I talked quickly and I covered all types of different things and you're like, what was the point of this session? I've tried to kind of summarize here. And so first, understand your regulatory and compliance obligations for all sites and locations. If you are a customer that sits in a specific state or location, like in the US, maybe not as important, but if you are a global organization or work across multiple locations, make sure you understand what obligations you are facing. Work with legal departments, work with HR, work with any type of data handling teams that you have to fully understand. Then you can start to assess your data landscape to understand where your data is held, the volume of that data, and what type of data may have increased sensitivity. So again, we're understanding, is there data that has to be kept retained per Department of Justice or legal entity reasons? Once you kind of understand that data landscape, and let me be clear, that is an exhaustive process that would likely take weeks, months of getting together with a lot of different stakeholders, you can start to formulate this end-to-end governance strategy. So it's going to be applying things like storage and access controls, content protection like sensitivity labels, retention and archiving solutions to help support e-discovery and different legal motions. And then, of course, content deletion, because most customers don't like to keep content they don't have to, especially if you're in a regulated industry. I'm not making legal guarantees or backs or advice here, but sometimes it's not great to keep content that's not needed, right? And so outside of storage reasons, if content isn't needed and you aren't required to keep it, typically customers do like to delete it. So that is a critical part of your kind of data governance strategy, is when something is allowed to no longer be kept. If your organization has decided we don't keep that data, go ahead and cut it off. As we move along, identify those kind of scenarios that might need heightened protection, either from a content level or from a container level. And then we can apply things like multi-factor auths, conditional access, combine those policies and have risk-based conditional access based on that. And a very quick example might be, as I'm trying to access a finance app while I'm working from home, even though this is a trusted IP and location for me, I actually don't have a problem that Microsoft IT wants me to go through MFA every time I access the app. It has confidential data. They want to ensure that my access is true and trusted. Last area is more related to end-to-end encryption. Work on those scenarios that might need heightened privacy. And again, sometimes that may mean like, hey, we want privacy, but we need artifacts like recording, translation. Other times we might not. And so you can use things like one-to-one calling. As we see more organizations start to return to the workplace, this is actually something we've seen end-to-end encryption become less of an importance, because you can, again, meet in those kind of isolated rooms. So that's not to dismiss that end-to-end encryption is something that is important in the industry, especially for consumers, and will be used within organizations. But I want to make it clear, it is not the end-all be-all solution that may have been branded a couple of years ago. It has its use cases, but in the organizational workplace, it is very specific. So I just threw a lot at you in about 39 minutes. I will go ahead and go back a slide here and hop over here to look for some questions. I don't see any. Maybe everyone's still trying to figure out. Oh, there we go. N10 is enabled. Can we identify this call in the Teams admin portal, call quality dashboard, access to audio and video metrics? That is a great question. Some of that content, yes, you will be able to have access to. We have to remember, though, anything that would be able to essentially provide evidence of who was involved in that call or what type of content would violate the principle of end-to-end encryption. And so it is available. End-to-end encryption is available G8 as of today. So right here, you can go and kind of take a look in call quality dashboard. Very limited information is out there, and that is by design and will likely stay that way. So Rajir, you can also follow up with me directly if you have feedback or want to know a little bit more. But in general, you will find performance, call quality data on an end-to-end encrypted communications by design is extremely, extremely limited.
Awesome stuff. Love that, John. It's fantastic. And what I'm getting from everything that you've just been through there is what I've felt from Microsoft over the past year or so. Any case that everything's coming together. There have been sort of disparate stories being told historically, but now things are getting unified, things are getting surfaced, like DLP can reference sensitivity labels, all that sort of stuff. And I think that's continuing, isn't it? We're getting things closer together, and that probably tells the story of why everything is getting called Defender now as well.
It is, and I will say two last things to wrap this up. Yes, Peter, you and I have talked a lot about different layers of security. Defense has to happen in layers. There is no one end-all be-all solution as much as we might want. So you will continue to see us invest in a portfolio of tooling that customers can use as needed. If a customer says end-to-end encryption solves everything for me, we're happy. But we found most customers that's not the end-all be-all solution. And again, I will wrap this up with my personal view. I use end-to-end encryption for my personal consumer life to communicate. I feel like it's a nice protection. If I, John Gruszczyk, was running my own company, not Microsoft, completely disconnected, I would not enable end-to-end encryption widely. I just, from a legal, privacy, plenty of other reasons, make sure you have your research done before you jump into that. So again, there's a huge solution and use case for it. Be careful with it because I will just end with this statement. You don't know what's happening in there. So Peter, if I worked for your company and I started stealing all of your data and sent it through an end-to-end encrypted communication, you have no idea. So we like to think people are good. Just understand end-to-end encryption can be used in a malicious way. It's not designed that way, but it can be. So just make sure you understand the full use case, limitations, how it's used. Reach out to me, listen to Peter and Chris's shows because they're very intelligent on this type of stuff. So again, I've gone over now. Peter, thank you so much for having me. Anyone, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you don't have my email, I'll give it to you. I want to hear if this has landed with you, what we can do to keep working. So again, thank you to everyone for joining.